So we're on to Priest. Priest is like playable in Journey to Ungoro, but it's still like the third worst class probably. Pretty big gap between it and Hunter, and of course Warlock, but it could still use some love. First up we have Spirit Lash. I think this card is really good. One of the issues with Priest as a control class is it doesn't really have things to do in the early turns a lot of the time. On turn 2 you're usually going for like Shadow Word Pain or something, but this gives you an early game AoE. Outside of this, your earliest AoE is Shadow Word Horror, which a lot of times is just hot garbage. After that it's Holy Nova, which a lot of times is hot garbage. And you don't really get a good, reliable AoE until turn 6 in Dragonfire Potion. Or I guess you can play Auchenized Soul Priest Circle of Healing, but that's also unreliable. So it's cheap AoE for Priest. The lifesteal on it helps keep you alive. I'm not sure how good lifesteal is going to be in Priest because you have your hero power. It might end up being even better because when you combine it with your hero power, you're impossible to kill. This card also scales incredibly well with spell damage. Not sure how much you really want to be playing spell damage in Priest, but this works with Malygos and Prophet Velen, which I think might actually be relevant in the next expansion. Depending on the metagame, maybe this card is just going to be outclassed by Potion of Madness as early game removal, or maybe you just play a total of 4 of those cards and you just wreck aggro. Card seems really good. I think I'm rating this as a 4-star card. I think there's actually potential for this card to be 5 stars. Cheap AoE is never something to laugh at. It also combos kinda nice with Wild Pyromancer, I guess. Proc the Pyro and also do another 1 damage. Shadow Ascendant. At the end of your turn, give another random friendly minion +1/+1. I mean, it's kind of a 2-mana 3/3. Spoiler alert for neutrals, Priest actually got a 2-mana 3/3. But this is kind of a 2-mana 3/3. If you get to buff your Northshire Cleric up to a 2/4, I guess that's pretty good, but you don't get to trade with it as a 2/4 until turn 3, which is kind of a bummer. Maybe you're supposed to coin this out on turn 1 with your Snow Flipper Penguin, and you have 2 2/2s on the board already. Dank aggro Priest combo. But as far as 2-drops and Priest go, I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't complain about another good one, but I think they're pretty satisfied with Radiant Elemental right now. And I don't think this card is better than Radiant Elemental. The fact that you have to wait for the stats is kind of a bummer. It can snowball pretty hard, but it's also just a 2-mana 2/2, so it's going to die to Jade Claws, it's going to die to every 2-drop, it's going to die to a buffed up Firefly. Maybe if this was like a Warlock card, it could be pretty sick in Zoo. But in Priest, I think it's probably not going to be finding a home in many real decks. Maybe a couple of my decks, though. Acolyte of Agony, 3-mana 3/3 lifesteal. Makes you wonder why you're not just playing Earthen Ring Farseer. You get the healing immediately. This thing isn't going to save you from aggro the turn you're going to die. But the upside over Earthen Ring Farseer is it has the potential to heal you for ridiculous amounts. But to get more than 3 healing, you're going to need to attack with this twice, or have it be in combat twice, I guess I should say. And that doesn't seem that easy to do. And I suspect in Priest, Lifesteal is probably less valuable than it is in other classes since they have their hero power and other good healing options. So I kind of think this card probably isn't that good, but if you play it on turn 3 against aggro, unlike Earthen Ring Farseer, they can't really just ignore it because it's going to keep healing you and it's going to be hard for them to kill you eventually. But it's also just a 3-mana 3/3, dies to Fiery War Axe against Pirate Warrior. Seems weak. I think the 3-star rating on Acolyte of Agony might even be a little bit generous. Eternal Servitude. I like this card a lot, and I think it's actually very strong. You get to discover a minion that died this game and summon it. So unlike Resurrect, where you're just like throwing dice and hoping you hit the right thing, in a Resurrect or Onyx Bishop deck, you can't really afford to be playing like Northshire Cleric or Radiant Elemental or whatever early game, because if you hit those off your Resurrect effects, you feel really bad. But with Eternal Servitude, you have so much more control over it. You can play early game shitters to help you survive through the game. And since this is only 4 mana, you just need to discover a Mind Blast with your Shadow Visions, and then you play Eternal Servitude for Prophet Velen or Malygos, triple Mind Blast, and they take 30 damage. Seems pretty sick. It's probably going to be hard to reliably get the 3rd Mind Blast, but Eternal Servitude double Mind Blast really doesn't seem that difficult to me. You can even do some pretty ridiculous things if you get like some Radiant Elementals on the board, double Eternal Servitude, and then you can double Mind Blast for like 40 damage. I think a Velen Malygos Priest might actually be a thing with this card. And of course this card would have been sick in the Ultrasort Priest I played recently. Just barns out some big shit and resummon it with this. It's really good with the Obsidian statue we're going to see soon. Any priest deck that doesn't play like a ridiculous amount of early games and plays a reasonable amount of late game minions is probably going to like this card. One thing to note is it's usually pretty bad on turn 4, but you can also play it with Injured Blademaster on curve, and I really don't feel that bad about paying 4 mana for a 4/7. Just the amount of flexibility, the amount of combos with this card, and even just the reliability, I think this card is actually sick. I think this might end up being one of the best cards in the set. And it's certainly going to be one of the most fun cards in the set. Unless it's also one of the best cards in the set, then it might be one of the least fun cards in the set. Whatever. Let's play 4 mana Ultra Source. Devour Mind, bigger Thoughtsteal. Thoughtsteal's okay. Kabbalah's Tome is okay. Nourish is okay. Seems like this card could see play in the right metagame. It draws from your opponent's deck instead of from your deck. So it's more for control matchups where you are really trying to outvalue the opponent. If you're in the greedy priest mirror and they play their release before you, you can give them big ol' fuck you and draw the pack before they do. Card seems okay in the right metagame, certainly not an auto-include. A lot of times it's probably going to be too greedy, but if you need the greed, it's a solid option. Shadow Essence. This card is really reminiscent of Barnes. It costs quite a bit more mana, but the minion you get from it is a 5/5 instead of a 1/1 shitter. On turn 6, I'm still pretty happy to be pulling Yashiraj or Ysera from my deck. And even if you're trying to play high rolly cards like that, maybe Obsidian Statue also, you really don't feel that bad also playing like Crystalline Oracles or maybe even a Radiant Elemental. Buffing one of those guys up to 5/5 is maybe worth kinda close to 6 mana. You probably do need better high rolls than that. But I think this card is costed in a way that even the low rolls from it really aren't that bad. Off the top of my head, I can't really think of any small minions that you'd really want to be targeting with this, as opposed to like Crystalline Oracle or whatever, where you're just kind of like okay if it hits it. Maybe you can play some dank meat wagon combos with this. Probably not though. I don't know, maybe if the things you're trying to pull are like Malygos and Ysera, you also just throw meat wagons in that deck. Comes out as a 5/5 and when it dies it summons your real Ysera. Could be a thing, who knows. Or you can also just play this in the Vel and Malygos deck to tutor those out. And even if you can't kill them this turn, which maybe you can because you can go Shadow Essence double Mind Blast, and then the thing dies and then you just play your Eternal Servitude for 4 later and then you kill them with that. You can also just play this alongside Barnes. You really don't want to be hitting Barnes himself with this, but it's like 3 Barnes effects and these 2 are spells, so they won't interfere with your real Barnes. I think this card has a lot of potential. If you're not trying to do something specific though, it might just be a little bit too expensive to just throw in a normal priest deck, but I know I will be able to find a home for this card. Embrace Darkness. It's like a mind control for 4 less mana, but you do have to wait a turn for the effect to go through. It kind of has the corruption clause on it. So the issue with the waiting to take control of this card is if you're playing it against a deck that's about to kill you, then they can just use the minion you targeted to continue killing you for a turn. If you're playing it against control or a mid-range deck or whatever, and you have a thing on board, you target their thing, they're just going to trade their thing into your thing, and even if their thing doesn't die, you're only going to get a thing with like 2 health, and that's not really too impressive. But as a priest, you tend to have a lot of healing. If you're doing things right, you're probably not almost dead on turn 6, although sometimes you don't really have a say in that. But if you're not almost dead on turn 6, you can just play this and eat the damage, and then you got a 6 mana mind control, which is pretty sick. I'm not sure if the minion you steal can attack the turn you steal it, because you steal it at the start of your turn, but in theory it's already been on the board for a while, so it probably shouldn't have summoning sickness. But yeah, card seems pretty good if you're in a position where you can actually eat the damage, and then get a 6 mana mind control. In Journey to Un'Goro, I played a deck that had Corruption and Corrupting Mist with freeze effects. So you freeze their thing and then corrupt it, and then it doesn't matter that you have to wait a turn, it's just going to die. And maybe you can do something similar with Embrace Darkness. Maybe like Elemental Priest that plays Glacial Shard, and I guess you can't really combo it with Frost Elemental because they're both 6 mana cards. But Glacial Shard could work, I guess, kinda. Man, I didn't really think about it until I started thinking about Corruption, but if you can silence this effect off that, it's going to be a bummer. But Spikeridge Seed is also a 6 mana and get fucked by silence, and that card sees a lot of play, so it's probably fine. Anyway, if you're a control priest that isn't going to die when you play this card, it's probably pretty good. Obsidian Statue, sick Eternal Servitude target. sick Shadow Essence target, sick Barnes target, sick turn 9 play. Just a really strong minion. I do think that the combination of Taunt and Death Rattle destroy a random enemy minion is not necessarily that great, because then they can just trade their things into your thing. If they trade like 2 Yetis into this to kill it, they're going to have 2 4-1s, and woohoo, your Death Rattle dealt 1 damage. Typically Death Rattles like this are pretty easy to play around, but let's not forget this is also a 4-8 lifesteal taunt. It's probably going to be healing you for more than 4 because there aren't too many things that one-shot this. And anything that they do have that one-shots this is probably going to have a hard time value trading into it. And if your opponent's playing a deck that has a thing that can one-shot this, unless it's Bitter Tide Hydra, then you probably don't really care about the lifesteal. Also, if you play this in the right position against another control deck, it's kind of immune to removal spells. Because if they try to, I don't know, Meteor this guy or something, when they have an Alexstrasza on the board, then this thing's going to kill the Alexstrasza anyway, so they kind of just have to trade into it. So it seems pretty good. And as the Taunt Lifesteal 4-8 minion, if you play this card on turn 9 against aggro, you're pretty much going to win every time. If you Barnes into this and then Eternal Servitude it, you just straight up beat aggro also. The card seems pretty strong, but it does cost 9 mana. Sometimes it's hard to live until turn 9. Oftentimes, as Priest, if you've made it to turn 9, you've already won the game in matchups where this might be relevant. I also have to wonder, is this card worth playing over Primordial Drake? The jump from 8 to 9 mana is probably one of the most significant in the game, because at 8 mana you can do other things, at 9 mana it may as well cost 10 mana. Do you really want to be playing Primordial Drakes and this? Maybe not, but on its own this card is certainly strong. I think it will definitely see play in some capacity somewhere. If nothing else, just because you can cheat it out and resummon it so easily. Card is dope. Beats aggro, good against control. Arch Benedictus. Maybe one of the craziest cards they've ever printed. You get to shuffle a copy of your opponent's deck into your deck, which is cool. It's a 7 mana 4/6, so man, feels bad the turn you play it. It's like the ultimate fuck you, I'm not fatiguing card. But how often do games go to fatigue? Not very often. Comparing this with the other fuck fatigue options in Jade Idol and Dead Man's Hand, I think this is actually weaker than both of those. If you're playing this in a non-fatigue game, you're probably just diluting the synergy of your deck. As a priest, you'd probably rather be drawing your Shadow or Death than your opponent's Shield Slam or whatever. I mean, it's definitely going to be a fun highlight card, but as far as a competitive card, there's no way this card is good. But I do have the dream of the infinite game with the Benedictus Priest Mirror, where we keep copying each other's archbishops. We never fatigue and the game hits its 50 or 100 turn timer or whatever where the game just ends. That sounds dope. But yeah, with all that being said about how bad the card is, if we do find ourselves in the fatigue meta, this card is super strong. But we're never going to be in a fatigue meta, probably not even in a tournament setting. But if we do enter that meta, this card is strong. But again, I'm not sure it's better than Jade Idol or Dead Man's Hand, but I guess in that meta you're probably playing Skulking Geist to fuck over Jade Druid. But whatever, it's a bad card, it's probably a lot of fun though. Shadow Reaper Anduin. So when he comes into play, he destroys all the big stuff on the board. I actually just realized, like an hour ago, that this is all minions, not your opponent's minions, so you do have to be careful when you play this guy. But unlike some of the other Death Knights, I think the hero power is the big draw of Shadow Reaper Anduin. Deal 2 damage after you play a card, refresh this. So it's not unlikely that you'd be able to hero power twice in a turn to deal 4 damage. I think you really want to be playing this in a deck with Raza the Chained. That way you can hero power for 0 every time you play a card, which is really disgusting. In a deck like that, it's definitely not unthinkable that you could hero power 3 or 4 times in a turn. But you do have to be careful about the fact that you do lose your consistent source of healing when you play Shadow Reaper Anduin. But in the matchups where you need the healing, like against Freeze Mage or whatever, you can always just not play Shadow Reaper Anduin. And I think the rest of your deck with your Priest of the Feast or whatever is probably good enough to win you the game. And even if you do play Shadow Reaper Anduin, your Priest of the Feast might just be good enough to win you the game. Maybe the fact that you're wanting to give up your healing with this card is enough for Acolyte of Agony to see play, but probably not. But anyway, you do have to be careful about giving up your healing, but it's probably totally worth it. There's also the sickest of OTKs with this card, where you've played Raza at some point so your hero power costs 0. You get 2 Radiant Elementals on the board with a Shadow Visions in hand and a Shadow Visions in deck. and you hero power and shadow visions into shadow visions, and then you hero power and shadow visions into shadow visions, and you just keep doing that, and you just deal 30 damage with your hero power and they die. I'm kind of curious to know if you're even going to have enough time in your turn for that, but I'm certainly going to be trying that combo. One issue is you do need to be playing double Radiant Elemental and double Shadow Visions in a deck with Raza, which of course wants you to have singletons. But Radiant Elemental and Shadow Visions are damn good cards on their own, and now that we're not playing Reno in these decks anymore since he rotated out, it's not necessarily as important to have like Raza immediately active on turn 5 or Kazakus immediately active on turn 4, like it was basically a necessity with Reno. Of course, you don't want those cards to be unavailable to you for too long, but compared to the days of Reno, I think you are less upset playing duplicates now. So anyway, the meme OTK combo is probably not going to happen very often, but the hero power is damn good on its own, especially if you can get it to cost 0, use it 3 or 4 times in a turn. And I've been talking a lot about the hero power, but the battle cry on this guy is pretty damn good too. If you can destroy 2 minions with 5 or more attack, that on its own might already be approaching 8 mana worth of value, and then your armor and hero power are just free at that point. There's also the Battlecry Dream, where the Jade Druid goes all in and you get to destroy their 10-10 through 16-16 Jade Golems, and then still lose because they play more the next turn, but let's not talk about that. Anyway, this card seems pretty good. Seems like the kind of card Control Priest would want. I think you're almost certainly playing this in a Raza deck because of how good Void Form is when it costs 0 mana. Seems like a pretty good card. So Priest actually got a really nice set of cards. Their Death Knight is definitely playable, probably one of the better ones. They got Eternal Servitude, which is pretty sick. I think the Malygos Velen deck might actually be a thing, so it's nice that they found a new archetype. They got a really sick control card in Obsidian Statue that also synergizes with some of their new cards. Spirit Lash is a really nice anti-aggro tool. There are a few cards that maybe have some fringe play depending on metagames. And even though their legendary is garbage, he's one of the most interesting and potentially one of the most fun legendaries that's ever been printed. So I think if you're a Priest main, you should probably be pretty happy with this expansion. Of course, you do always have to worry that even though a lot of these cards look pretty good, they're still Priest cards, and Priest is one of those classes that tends to look like it's going to get good cards and then still suck because it's Priest. In Journey to Un'Goro, Rogue got a new archetype, and in Journey to Un'Goro, Rogue lost that new archetype. So it's basically just a Miracle class again. It should be interesting to see if Frozen Throne supports Miracle or brings in a new archetype. Or neither, and Miracle lists look exactly like they did in the last expansion. Plague Scientist. I liked this card a lot when I first saw it. It seemed like a card I'd be pretty happy to play in Tempo Rogue, and I am a pretty big fan of Tempo Rogue. But then when you think about this card more, if you're playing it on turn 3 or coining it out on turn 2 or whatever, is it really better than SI7 Agent? A lot of times SI7 Agent is just going to kill the opponent's thing on its own. This thing is going to need a minion to combo with it, and how often is the poisonous on a small minion going to be worth more than the small minion plus the 2 damage from SI7 Agent? But Tempo Rogue does play like Swashbuckler and Patches and maybe Firefly, so they do have quite a few shitters to make this card pretty reliable. Also, compared to SI7 Agent, if the opponent has nothing, you can just Plague Scientist your Firefly, go face with it that turn, and then if they want to play a thing next turn, you can always just poison that thing. And then if you're getting to late game, how does this card really compare to Vile Spine Slayer? Of course it's cheaper, so it's a little bit easier to work into a curve, but you don't have to have a thing on the board for Vile Spine Slayer to be relevant. But again, you can just kind of play this without your opponent having a thing if you need to. But I think once you're getting into late game, just making a 1-2 Poisonous Firefly on the board probably isn't as good. Also, this is a 3-mana 2-3, so you really don't want to be playing this without getting the combo out of it. It seems like an okay card. I'm definitely going to try it in Tempo Rogue, but I'm just not really sure if it's better than other things that rogues already have access to, particularly another 3-mana combo minion that actually has better stats. Leeching Poison. Give your weapon lifesteal. The healing rogue needed? ? Probably not. I mean, you can heal for 12 with your Assassin's Blade, but that's going to take 4 turns, and you're going to have to invest this card into it. You have to risk your Assassin's Blade being on the board. If it gets oozed, you feel really bad. Like, you already felt bad about ooze hitting your Assassin's Blade. You feel even worse about it when you also spent 2 mana on that card. Rogue did get a new weapon, but I don't think this has particularly good synergy with it. Card seems a little bit underwhelming to me. I feel like Rogue doesn't really have the weapons to support it, and even if they did, this card is really bad against weapon removal. And you're never playing this card on your dagger. What a joke that would be. Seems bad. Bone Baron. What am I supposed to do with this card? The skeletons you get are 1-mana minions, so they are combo enablers, I guess, but you'd really much rather have combo enablers that draw cards off Gadgets and Auctioneer. They do still help with activating other combos, like maybe Plague Scientist. They help with Edwin Van Cleef. But from what I've seen, if you're playing Rogue, you already played your 14/14 Edwin Van Cleef on turn 2, so I don't think the skeletons have too much synergy with that. Maybe it would be okay in like a N'Zoth Rogue or something, but I feel like even there you have better options. If you're playing a Tempo Rogue or something, I feel like I'd rather play Lotus Assassin. It definitely doesn't fit in Miracle Rogue because it costs 5 mana and doesn't help with miracles. And I don't think that this expansion is creating a new Rogue archetype that really wants this card. Like, it's a fine enough card, but I can't really ever imagine a world where there's a competitive Rogue deck that really wants this card. I think it's just bad. Shadowblade. When this card was first shown, people were like losing their shit over it. They were like, finally a good weapon for Rogue. Paladins play Rallying Blade as a 3-mana 3/2, Hunters play Eaglehorn Bow. It doesn't matter if it's one more expensive than Fiery War Axe. But here's the thing. Since Classic, Rogue has had a card called Deadly Poison, which is a 1-mana spell which when combined with your hero power is a 3-mana 3/2 weapon. But Deadly Poison is also better at activating combos. You can cycle it with Gadgets and Auctioneer. You can split the mana up over 2 turns. So as far as 3-mana 3/2 weapons go, Deadly Poison is probably better than this card, and Deadly Poison hasn't seen play since we lost Blade Flurry. So I'm not too excited about this card, but maybe you play Shadowblade with Deadly Poison, and then you can make a 5/2 weapon, and maybe that's good enough. This card also has a Battle Cry. Your hero is immune this turn. Is that worth giving up the 1-mana spell synergy of Deadly Poison? I don't think it makes it significantly better, so I think this will only see play if it and Deadly Poison end up in the same deck. I mean, being immune the turn you use this is pretty nice. If you're playing this on curve, I guess you get to heal for like 3. Woohoo! Rogue does kind of have a dying problem, so any healing you can get is pretty solid, I guess. I don't know. Seems like a fine card, but I'm just not really that sold on it. It seems hard for me to imagine that this card is playable, and Deadly Poison has not been playable for the last year or however long. But there is some new weapon synergy. Like I said, maybe you play this with Deadly Poison. Maybe Pirate Rogue is a thing now and you want a good weapon for it or something. But then in that deck you don't really care about the Battle Cry on this. I don't know. Fine card, but seems kind of underwhelming. Runeforge Haunter. So as a 4-mana 5/3, you want this text to be really good. During your turn, your weapon doesn't lose durability. Meh. You definitely need the weapon to be better than your hero power weapon. I guess this does come on curve right after Shadowblade, so maybe that's kind of a reason that you want to play Shadowblade. If you do actually get to use this text and you swing it through up into the turn you play this guy, then at worst he gave your weapon +1 durability, which as we know from Pirate Warrior is a very strong effect, especially for an aggro deck. So if you're just trying to slam Shadowblade on turn 3 and punch the opponent in the face with it, maybe you're trying to throw out some Dread Corsairs or something, and then you can Runeforge Haunter, so the next turn you can just punch them again with that Shadowblade for free. Maybe that could be pretty good. Maybe Pirate Rogue becomes a thing because of this card. This card also does have some synergy with like Leeching Poison and what's the card from the last expansion? Envenom Weapon? Something like that. So you can get some more value out of those kinds of cards. But those cards are just bad because people play Acidic Swampoos and whatnot. And even if this ends up working in the aggro deck that plays pirates or just wants to punch the opponent in the face with weapons, you kind of have to ask, why am I not just playing Pirate Warrior? So I do have kind of a hard time envisioning a world where this card is going to see play. But this just says during your turn your weapon doesn't lose durability. It doesn't say anything about needing to attack with the weapon. So what you do is, you play Medivh Rogue, and then when you play spells with your Atiesh in play, it doesn't lose durability, so you just get to keep getting minions off your Medivh weapon. And that seems pretty dope, right? Of course, Rogue doesn't really have the spells to support that. And if it did, you're still spending 4 mana on a 5/3 the turn you want to combo, but it could potentially be a lot of value. It'd be a good meme deck at least, right? And who knows, maybe this card actually ends up going somewhere in an aggro deck. It's actually a pretty interesting card. Roll the Bones. You need to be playing a lot of Death Rattles for this card to draw more than one, and if you're not drawing more than one, you may as well just play Shiv. I think I've seen some math that to average 1.5 draws you need like 15 Death Rattles in your deck, and that's never going to happen. So can't really imagine this card being competitive when Shiv exists and doesn't really see play. I'm not entirely sure how the cast this again mechanic works. If it actually counts as casting another spell, you can do some pretty sick things with a deck that plays 28 Death Rattles, a Roll the Bones, and a Mana Addict. And you coin out the Mana Addict, you roll the Bones, and then you kill the opponent on turn 2. That seems pretty dope. And maybe there are some other pretty sick combos that involve fatiguing yourself with a bunch of Death Rattle minions in your deck. Can't really imagine what that combo would be, but could be a thing. I actually don't think this card works with the Mana Addict combo, so it's probably just bad, even in meme decks. But damn, that's going to be spicy if it works. Probably not competitive though, because you need to be playing too many Death Rattles. But if you do find yourself playing that many Death Rattles, it's probably a pretty reasonable card. Doomerang. This card's pretty cool. You throw your weapon at a minion, it deals its damage and then returns to your hand. But we continue running into this problem with Rogue, where you have to wonder what weapon you're comboing this with. Combo it with your Shadow Blade? Cool, I guess. You get another Shadow Blade in your hand, but I'm still not even entirely convinced that Shadow Blade is a good card. Using this with your Hero Power Dagger is pretty awful. But in that situation, it's still a 1-mana spell for Auctioneer. Maybe that could be relevant. I think Rogue is probably going to need better weapons for this card to see play. But worth mentioning though, it does say that the weapon deals the damage, unlike Blade Flurry where the spell deals the damage. So if your weapon has Lifesteal or Poisonous, I believe those effects do trigger, so that could be a thing. But it's probably not a thing, because I think we've already established that Leeching Poison and Envenom weapons suck. Even on their own they kinda suck, but they especially suck in a metagame with Acidic Swamp Ooze and Bloodsail Corsair and stuff like that. But if Rogue gets a better weapon, this card could potentially be really scary. Also, another card for Medivh Rogue. Looks like that's the archetype they're pushing. Not entirely sure how this card works with Atiesh if you only have one charge on it. I don't know the exact text on that card. I guess I know from AoE spells that the minion summoned after the spell is cast. So I don't know if Doomerang sending it down to 0 mana would return the Atiesh to your hand. But I mean, I'm still going to play it in Medivh Rogue, so it doesn't really matter how it works. Maybe I'm even too generous giving Doomerang 3 stars. But if Rogue does get a good weapon, the card is sick. Anyway, Spectral Pillager. 6 mana 5/5. Combo, deal damage equal to the number of other cards you've played this turn. Even if you've managed to play 3 other cards, this card is worse than Fire Elemental. It costs 6 mana, so how easy is it even going to be to play 3 other cards? Seems like it's just way too hard to get a significant amount of damage out of this combo. Maybe there's some kind of cheesy thing that you can do to deal a ridiculous amount of damage with this. Maybe some kind of weird like Shadowcaster combo. But even then, this guy himself costs 6 mana. So the rest of your combo is going to have to be pretty cheap. If you're doing ridiculous cheap card combos in Rogue, why aren't you just drawing your entire deck with Gadgetzan Auctioneer? Seems like this card is just way too hard to make work. I think it sucks. If you can make it work, maybe it's broken though, but I just can't see it. Unplayable, I say. Lillian Voss. So as a 4-mana 4/5, you don't feel bad just playing this card. Replacing the spells in your hand with random spells from the opponent's class though is kinda sketchy. I guess the place you really want to be playing this is in like a Burgle Rogue. That way if you play Swashbuckler and get Totemic Might, you can try to get something better than Totemic Might. You can kind of re-roll your thieving effects, but only if they landed on spells. And this card also has the thieving synergy to go along with your Obsidian Shard and Ethereal Peddler, so I think this is a pretty cozy fit in that deck. I could also see this having some potential in Miracle Rogue. Sometimes you get to the point in the game where you don't really want your preps or your coins or your backstabs or whatever. In some sense, this could end up being like a third Gadgetzan Auctioneer, in that it can be a way to get some value out of your cheap spells. but I think it's probably a lot worse than Gadget Sand Auctioneer in that deck. And you can always just low roll into some pretty garbage spells. But if you're low rolling into garbage spells, maybe you can just use those with Auctioneer. I don't know. Seems like a pretty strong battle cry if you can land it in the right spot. But it might just break your deck synergy too much to be playable. I think it's really good in Burgle Rogue, though. Maybe 4 stars is a little bit generous on Lillian Voss. She seems really good in Burgle Rogue, but how good is Burgle Rogue, really? Anyway, on to the Death Knight. Valera the Hollow. So her battle cry is gaining stealth until your next turn, and that's your hero that gains stealth. So the opponent can't fireball you, they can't attack you with Arcanite Reaper or Leroy Jenkins. It's going to be very hard to die the turn you play Lyra the Hollow. You can still also die to like Fellfire Potion kind of things, but since you're gaining 5 armor, it's going to be pretty hard for anything that can't target to kill you, because you're going to be at 6 at a minimum. If you are at exactly 6, and it's pretty common that when you play this card you go up to 6, mages can start teching Raider Arcane Missiles, and then that can just kill you, and man, does that feel bad. But anyway, most of the time you're not going to die when you play Valera the Hollow, so I think she is often going to, at worst, buy you a turn. And then her hero power, each turn you passively just get a Shadow Reflection in your hand. Whenever you play another card, Shadow Reflection becomes a copy of that, and it keeps changing throughout the turn. It doesn't like lock on to the first card you play. And then at the end of your turn, I believe the Shadow Reflection leaves your hand, so you can never have more than 1 in your hand. So there are a couple ways to use these Shadow Reflections. You can use it for value. If you're trying to grind someone out, then every turn you can get a copy of, like some 5-cost card in your deck or something. Or for removal, you can get a copy of your Eviscerate, or to go face, you can get a copy of your Eviscerate. You can also do some pretty ridiculous combos using cards you're not supposed to have 3 of, like Cold Blood. You can South Sea Deckhand, triple Cold Blood, Faceless Manipulator, I think that's 28 damage. And that is pretty hard to deal with. 10 mana, 28 damage burst is pretty tough. How often are you actually going to get that exact 28 damage burst? Well, if you're playing this in Miracle Rogue, you're probably drawing your whole deck, so it's probably somewhat reliable. But the great thing about Valera the Hollow is, it doesn't matter what specific combos your deck can do, because the card is so flexible and it can work over so many turns, that at some point you're going to be able to do something ridiculous. And that, I think, is really the strength of this card. So you can definitely play a sick value game with this card. You can definitely do some ridiculous burst combos, some ridiculous removal combos. But of course the drawback of this is the turn you play it, you gain 5 armor, and that's it. So you're basically just giving your opponent another turn to develop the board and probably kill you the following turn. So you really need to be doing something significant on the following turn. A lot of people have said you play Vanish with this card, you play her on 9, they try to fill up their board and then you just vanish. That can be kind of okay, or you can also just kill them with the South Sea Deckhand combo and then it doesn't matter what they developed, unless it's a taunt. So there is a definite drawback to this card. There's also the obvious drawback of can't play until turn 9, which if you're playing this in Miracle Rogue, which kinda looks like it's the only rogue deck, do you really want such an expensive card? Not necessarily sure, but you probably don't want to be drawing this with your Gadget Sand Auctioneer on turn 6, it's going to break your spell chain. But I just think the card is so flexible, it's pretty likely to see some amount of play. It might even end up being one of the best Death Knights. I've said it multiple times, but you can get ridiculous value, stupid combos. At the very least, it's almost always going to buy you a turn. So even if you don't need to copy the Eviscerate you're about to top deck, it just gives you an extra turn to draw it for lethal. Seems like Valera the Hollow just has so much potential. So if I were a rogue main, I'm not sure I would be too happy with this set of cards. Valera the Hollow is probably the most exciting of them. Lillian Voss makes Burgle Rogue look quite a bit better, I think. And I've somehow convinced myself that maybe she sees play in Miracle Rogue. Plague Scientist definitely has some potential in Tempo Rogue, I don't think it's doing much for Miracle Rogue. They also got, 4 weapon synergy cards, but I'm just not really convinced it's going to pan out. I think this is going to be the 10th expansion in a row, where Rogue gets a bunch of garbage and then just keeps making miracles. I hope you like Miracle Rogue. Or maybe I'm wrong about the Shadowblade card. If I am wrong about Shadowblade, Runeforge Haunter and Doomerang go up in value quite a bit. I don't see it though.